This is Eric LeCaine here on the Jam on DZRJ, 8:10 a.m., the voice of the Philippines. We're just bouncing around the world. I thought next, since we're kind of on this subject and we're working our way through it, let's go to the United States, because Senator John McCain described this Trump-Russian scandal as a centipede. We are not waiting for the shoe to drop. We're waiting for the other 99 shoes to drop. I mean, remember Michael Flynn? I talked about him last week. He's the national security advisor to Donald Trump. He's the guy that supplied the Russian ambassador with the info that the U.S. would possibly drop sanctions to Russia so that they shouldn't react to Obama's sanction after they interfered in the USA election. Remember that guy? Well, he just said this week that he would testify about everything that happened in a Senate hearing in the U.S. if they would agree to give him complete immunity from criminal prosecution. This is the exact same Flynn that said before in a taped interview on television that if you have to ask for immunity, then you must have done something wrong. Anyway, he said he knows a lot and he wants to tell his story. So let's just recap what we know so far about all these people that are involved in this scandal, in case you've missed anything and you really want to know. First, there's Jared Kushner. He's the son-in-law of Donald Trump. He has just been given the position of head of the office of a lot of stuff. He's running everything now in the White House. He met with Sergei Gorgov, who's the chairman of a Russian state-controlled bank. The U.S. slammed sanctions on that bank after Russia invaded Crimea. So you can't do any business with this bank. So this Donald Trump's son-in-law was meeting with this guy. And he also met with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, the same guy that Michael Flynn had met with. Next is Jeff Sessions. He also met with the Russian ambassador, even though he told the Senate that he had not. And that lie forced him to recuse himself from all Russian investigations. Now, next is Flynn, who also spoke to Kislyak, the ambassador, as well as discussed those sanctions that were put in place by Obama. When questioned by the vice president, he said he didn't discuss sanctions at all with Kislyak. And that turned out to, of course, be a lie. And he was fired after that. Although the question remains that the Donald Trump knew about this and was warned that Flynn had been compromised, because it turns out that the U.S. was listening in on the phone call that Flynn had with the Russian ambassador. Also, Flynn was paid tens of thousands of dollars and a free flight to Russia to sit at a dinner next to Vladimir Putin. He's also said to have been paid by the Turkish government. However, he was not registered as an agent of the Turkish government. So that was a big issue because he had not registered as an agent. So that brings us to Paul Manafort. Now, he was Trump's campaign manager. I hope everybody's following this. He also worked with the former president of the Ukraine and who's close friends with Vladimir Putin. He was recently forced out of the Ukraine and fled to Moscow. He's the guy that stole a bunch of money from the Ukraine, and when they broke into his house, they found those golden toilet bowls. Anyway, Paul Manafort was paid $10 million by a Russian oligarch, what's his name? Oleg Deripaska, who also had close ties to Vladimir Putin. The contract states that he would influence politics, business dealings, and news coverage in the United States, Europe, and the former Soviet republics to benefit the Putin government. Former policy advisor to Trump, Carter Page, also was on this list, who's part of the investigation of the FBI into his ties with the Russian government. And lastly, Roger Stone, who somehow predicted that the DNC emails stolen by the Russian hackers would soon be released, and then they were. He also has connection with Guccifer 2, which is a Russian front used to post stolen documents from the Clinton campaign. All right, so let's get back to Michael Flynn, because I just wanted to kind of get everybody up to date on this. He's approached the Senate and the House committee and the FBI and has offered that he will tell his whole story if they will just give him this kind of Edgar Mabato style immunity. His lawyer sent this kind of odd statement. General Flynn certainly has a story to tell, and he is very much wants to tell it, should the circumstances permit. But he's got to have immunity. So this bizarre thing about this guy, Flynn, in the Trump people, the thing that I never quite understood, and I never will understand, is why they hired this guy, Michael Flynn. 2014, he was the head of the Pentagon, but he got fired because it was disastrous. Then he had the dinner with Putin, personally led the standing ovation to President Putin. Since he was on the Trump campaign, questions come up as to whether he was paid at that dinner. And of course, it turns out that he was. Then it turns out that he was on the payroll of the Turkish government to promote that country's interest in the United States. So all this, and still they hired this guy to be the head of national security, the most sensitive job that you could possibly have. The Trump people said, we're making a big deal of this. Then Sally Yates, the attorney general, came to the Trump people and said, hey, you know what? This guy is colluding with the Russians, and he's lying about it. That he was compromised, possibly open to blackmail. They said, okay. But there's nothing here. And then Sally Yates, of course, was fired soon after that. Almost 3 weeks later, they finally were forced to fire Michael Flynn. And the reason they gave was that he misled the vice president. He misled the vice president. Now, the vice president had no idea what was going on. Even if your back is turned and 2 buses crash into each other, isn't it going to make a noise? Aren't people going to run screaming, sirens going off? The vice president didn't know. He didn't hear a thing. Just fascinating what's going on now in U.S. politics. The Senate has stated the only way they would grant immunity to Michael Flynn is if his story would give them a bigger fish to fry. And there's only one fish that's bigger than Michael Flynn. And who do you think that is? Donald Trump.